35 feet long, weighed nearly 7,000 pounds when fully combat loaded, and could reach an altitude of 37,000 feet and had a range of nearly 700 miles. But it came too late in the war effort to really make the difference. Probably the most famous bit of advanced technology that did see white deployment was the V program, the rocket program. If the Me-262 fighter jets were tactical weapons used to protect German skies from Allied aerial assaults and blunt enemy ground attacks, the rocket program was designed as an instrument of terror. The program was designed as revenge against British and American bombing of German cities. The goal was for London to be hit by up to 3,000 missiles a week. On June 6, 1944, only a few hours after D-Day and Allied soldiers landed on the beaches of Normandy, orders were issued from German High Command to activate these rockets. The development of Hitler's retaliation weapons began with experiments in rocket technology in the early 1930s under the supervision of Army Captain Walter Dornberger and his associate, a rocket enthusiast named Werner von Braun, who famously led the Apollo moon mission program and made America's status as the first nation on the moon possible. By 1934, liquid-fueled gyrostabilized rocket prototypes had been designed. The next year, in order to keep the development of this weapon a secret, research laboratories, testing sites, and power plants and factory facilities were set up on an isolated island off the Baltic Sea coast of northern Germany. By 1939, models A1 through A4 of the aggregate rocket series were produced. But Hitler thought that the program wasn't needed, at least until the Luftwaffe lost the Battle of Berlin, and it needed another means of harassing England. The A4 program was restarted and given top priority, and testing of the missile commenced in 1942. This 40-foot-long, 12-ton rocket, which carried a 1-ton explosive warhead up to 200 miles, was known as the V-2. A successful launch occurred in 1942 after a number of failures, leading to further improvements in the device. In July of 1943, Hitler believed in the weapon's potential and ordered that it be mass-produced along with other large concrete launching bunkers. At the same time, a team of Luftwaffe scientists were working to create a weapon that was similar to the V-2, but would be cheaper to manufacture and take less time than the guided missile would. Within a few months, the Luftwaffe came up with a small, cheap, pilotless aircraft called the Anti-Aircraft Target Device, or better known as the Flying Bomb, or the V-1. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. For Hitler, the V-1 was a means of retaliation for the Allied bombing campaign against Germany without the risk of bomber losses on Germany's part, and it was quickly losing fighters and pilots as well. Codenamed Cherrystone, or Kirschen, the V-1 program was instituted at Peenemünde, that island north of Germany in the Baltic Sea. The V-1 looked like a small plane with a stovepipe over its tail and no cockpit. It was 25 feet long and had a 17-foot wingspan. The jet engine, which was housed in the stovepipe assembly, was fueled by 80% octane petrol. It had a 1-ton warhead and was launched by a catapult, or launching ramp, 150 feet in length. The bomb flew along a preset gyroscopic control course. It wasn't very accurate, but the goal was to mass produce, so it didn't really need to be. It was accurate enough at least to hit its intended objective, the city of London. The missile attack on the British capital, which was codenamed Target 42, was scheduled for Christmas Day 1943, but technical difficulties in the V-1's manufacture pushed this back to the summer of 1944, when 5,000 operational V-1s were ready to be sent against London. The operation was put under the control of Lieutenant General Erich Heinemans. The missile offensive would be carried out from more than 95 launch sites. These were small facilities with ski-shaped buildings designed to protect the personnel firing the missiles from explosions set off by unassembled flying bombs. In December 1943, 52 of these sites were bombed by Allied air units, resulting in the destruction of 7 sites. In response to the relentless Allied bombing, detachments of anti-aircraft guns were positioned around each installation. By January 1944, a quarter of the V-1 launch sites had been put out of action by Allied attacks. On June 13, 1944, even only 10 of the 55 V-1 launching ramps were ready. The first flying bombs, which traveled at 360 miles an hour, flew from their bases in northern France, each loaded with a ton of high explosives. aiming point for the V1 was London's Tower Bridge, and it took 22 minutes to reach the target. Of the 5 successfully launched flying bombs that day, 1 fell into the English Channel, 3 landed in open areas on the English East Coast, and the 5th, the only successful one, hit a railroad bridge, killing 6 people and injuring 9. On June 15th and 16th, the missile offensive resumed from 55 operational V1 sites, which launched 144 bombs on southern England. 73 of these struck London. For the next 3 months, the Germans fired an average of 97 bombs a day at London. Due to its speed, British anti-aircraft couldn't fire it out of the sky. By the end of August, 2,224 V1s had dropped on England, killing over 5,000 British subjects and destroying thousands of homes and factories. It was only the repeated Allied air attacks and the advance of their ground forces in France and Belgium that caused the Germans to dismantle their V1 bomb installations in those regions, and finally ending the V1 Blitz by September. The V1 danger was over, but a more serious missile threat was initiated by the Germans, the V2. It was fired from Holland, and the V2s used mobile launchers. In transit, the 12-ton, 46-foot-long rocket was laid out on a trailer, which transported the weapon and also served as its firing platform. Any small clearing would do to launch the V2, and it only took an hour to prepare and fire the missile, which could gain an altitude of 55 miles and a speed of 3,580 miles per hour with a range of 200 miles. Only 4 minutes after takeoff, the V2 would strike London. The program was controlled by the SS, and the first V2s were fired at Paris and London on September 8, 1944, from an area around The Hague in the Netherlands. During the next few weeks, more rockets, both V1s and V2s, hit London, with 82 falling on the city in November, killing hundreds of civilians. Antwerp was hit by nearly 1,000 rockets up to the end of the year, while a total of 447 were aimed at London. The last rockets of the war were fired from The Hague on March 27, 1945. The final V2 exploded in London, killing 134 and injuring 94. In total, Hitler's V2s killed 2,754 and wounded 6,523. There's one last of these rockets the Nazis wanted to use as a weapon. Hitler had one more retaliation weapon to prize, the V3, or the London gun as it was called. It was effectually an artillery piece. Following an initial firing charge that forced the projectile up the barrel, a set of secondary charges placed in lateral chambers along the length of the barrel, spaced 3 yards apart and firing electronically, would detonate, adding to the propellant's pressure and increasing the project's velocity and range to a maximum of 102 miles. So the V3 was a supergun, and the supergun's projectiles were 9 feet long, finned, and fitted with a 300-pound high-explosive warhead. The site for this new weapon, planned for the installation of a 50-gun battery, was a 2-mile labyrinth of concrete-lined tunnels and galleries dug out by forced labor near a village in northern France. These were the largest guns ever manufactured. The V3 barrels were 412 feet long, made of soft steel with 6-foot bores in diameter, and all fitted with conventional breech-loading mechanisms. The V3 site was first bombed by the British Royal Air Force on November 5, 1943, but it had negligible results. A test firing of the V3 battery by the Germans delivered 7 shells onto the town of Maidstone near London on June 13, 1944. This surprise bombardment caused a massive Allied bombing raid that involved 106 Handley Page Halifax 4-engine bombers against the position on July 6, 1944, which destroyed the site with bombs. By August, the Germans abandoned the facility. In September, the region fell into the hands of the Canadian First Army as they swept through Pas-de-Calais from the Normandy beachhead. All right, so let's hop back to speculative weapons. I thought it'd be nice to hop back and forth between science fiction weapons and actual weapons that were developed. And as I explained earlier, the reason that Nazis had this type of futuristic technology was due to it relying on more conventional weaponry and then having to develop things from Nazi labs and using that as propaganda late in the war. But speculative technology for the Nazis also comes out of the strange mind of Adolf Hitler and his long-ranging plans of what Germany would do following the war, such as ethnic Germans and Aryans colonizing Eastern Europe and liquidating the Slavic peoples and building a new capital called Germania with this ugly architecture. This is another facet of where these types of speculative weapons come from. Some of these include a fleet of long-range bombers meant to destroy New York City, or 1,000-ton tanks, or radio-guided bombs with a success rate that would be 80 times more accurate than that of its rivals. A few years ago, National Geographic aired a program called Nazi Secret Weapons, where a team of military historians used unearthed blueprints to reconstruct Third Reich technology to determine whether some of Hitler's top secret weapons could have changed the course of the war if they had been used. So even if these wonder weapons could have seen the light of day and been implemented in large numbers, would it have made any difference? One such speculative weapon was the Messerschmitt 264 bomber, also known as the America bomber. At the time, no bomber could cross the Atlantic without a refueling stopover. So Hitler wanted to leapfrog the aviation technology of the time with this proposed plane. The plan was for a 4-engine bomber that could carry 6.5 tons that Hitler hoped would rain down terror on America's eastern seaboard. A military historian, Sonke Neitzel, said that the general plan for the Germans was to start in France, fly 4,000 miles over the Atlantic, bomb New York, and then fly back to France. Hitler became consumed with this project as 3 prototypes of the bomber were built. Though the German Air Force targeted factories along the east coast of the U.S. starting in April 1942, by July 1944, Allied air raids successfully destroyed all of the Messerschmitt prototypes. These military historians say that this Messerschmitt was not a realistic plan. The only person really interested in putting this forward was Hitler, because other scientists and advisors didn't believe it was feasible and it would draw resources away from time-tested conventional weapons. But in the same year, Hitler gave orders to construct a tank called the Rat. This is considered by some to be the largest tank ever designed. The Rat was supposed to weigh 1,000 tons and extend 114 feet in length. It had such a large diameter projectile that its destructive blast could have been enormous. It could go through several feet of concrete and have incredible killing power. But again, like other super tanks, it didn't have any sort of mobility. You couldn't go down roads with it, you couldn't go over bridges with it, and it could go through a river, but who knows how much displacement it had. And with such positive displacement, positive buoyancy, we don't know if it would have stayed on the surface and been able to get across the river without becoming a submarine. Germany's Ministry of Armaments at the time decided it wasn't the best way to use the nation's dwindling resources. Now, something that could have had history-changing potential was the Fritz X bomber. The Fritz X was a precision bomber, which, according to prototype testing, had a success rate 80 times higher than other free-falling bombs of the time. It was first used in combat in 1943. This radio-guided bomb was used against one of the biggest battleships in the Italian Navy, the Roma. It sunk the ship after 2 hits in just 35 minutes, bringing 1,200 sailors down with it. Hitler then turned his attention to the U.S. Navy a few days later, targeting the USS Savannah, a cruiser used for U.S. landings in southern Italy. But the bomb didn't down the ship. It actually came down and penetrated the roof of the No. 3 gun turret. And it actually glanced off the breech of the center gun of that turret and continued down through the handling spaces and exploded in the magazine as it exited the bottom of the warship. This was actually a lucky thing for Savannah, because had it been contained within the magazine and the magazine completely detonated, then this would have broken the ship in half. In other documented cases, the bomber's power was so extreme that it rammed right through the ship, exploding only on the exit or in the water. Some military historians wonder if the bomb suffered from technical imperfection, explaining the reason why it wasn't used elsewhere, or if it was simply too powerful for its time and ahead of its time. Holger Boll, who's a model maker of life-size World War II weaponry who lives in Germany, partnered with American aviation experts to reconstruct the Fritz X bomber and tested it in privately owned part of California's desert. After reconstructing it, including the bomb's internal electronics, they teamed up with a company that owned several World War II aircraft. 2 Fritz X replicas were transported to the airfield, and they were loaded onto a B-25 aircraft. The Fritz X wasn't loaded with explosives, but the team designed an experiment to figure out the ballistics and destructive power of the reconstructive Nazi bomb. They drew an outline in the desert of the Roma battleship, which was more than 780 feet long and 100 feet wide, and tried to drop the Fritz X replicas on the target one at a time. The crew missed their target by